Why the U.S. supports Israel. The full historical truth, *. Why does the United States, the world's most powerful democracy, support Israel so strongly despite widespread criticism, global controversy, and decades of regional conflict? 2. Answer that. We must go back not just decades but centuries, 'cause this alliance is more than just politics. It's history, religion, war, strategy, economics, and power. This is the full truth behind the U.S.-Israel relationship. Chapter 1. Roots in Religion and Early Sympathy, 1600s to 1948 *. Sunlight streams through the sparse trees of a raw, new world. A small group of Puritans, clad in simple, dark clothing, are gathered for an outdoor sermon. Their faces are etched with a mixture of hardship and fervent faith. The story of profound connection to the land of Israel does not begin with strategic alliances or geopolitical interests. It begins much earlier, in the religious fervor of the first European settlers to arrive on these shores. Puritan meeting. House day dramatization, a fire crackles in a large hearth. Chris Mather, a respected minister in his late 50s, stands before his congregation, his voice filled with conviction. The Lord, in his infinite wisdom, has scattered the nation of the Jews. Yet the Scriptures prophesy a time of gathering, a time when they shall be restored to their ancient homeland. It is a promise as certain as the rising sun. As early as the 17th century, American Puritans, who saw themselves as a new Israel in a new promised land, were deeply invested in the biblical prophecy of a Jewish return to the Holy Land. For men like Chris Mather, a prominent minister and president of Harvard College, this wasn't just a theological footnote. It was a central tenet of their faith. Dr. Sarah Cohen, historian on camera, interviewed the Puritans' identification with the Israelites was profound. They read the Hebrew Scriptures with an intensity that is hard for us to grasp today. They saw in the Jewish story of exile and promised return a blueprint for their own destiny. They believed the conversion of the Jews and their restoration to Zion were necessary precursors to the second coming of Christ. So this idea of a restored Israel was woven into the very fabric of their Christian theology. Long before political Zionism ever existed, this belief, a form of Christian Zionism, was not a political program, but a deeply held religious conviction. It planted the initial seeds of American sympathy for the Jewish people, a people they knew primarily through the sacred pages of the Bible. Sweeping shots of 19th century America. Westward expansion, the construction of railways, burgeoning cities. The mood is one of optimism and romanticism. As America carved out its own identity in the 19th century. Its view of the Jewish people and their ancestral home was increasingly filtered through the lens of its own national experience. A romanticized vision of the Jewish struggle for sovereignty began to take hold. There was a certain Jewcentricity in 19th century American thought, a fascination with the Jewish people as a historic and resilient nation. Intellectuals and politicians began to align the Jewish plight with America's own revolutionary spirit. The idea of a people long oppressed, yearning for freedom and a land of their own, resonated deeply with the American narrative. This sentiment was not confined to the pulpit. In 1844, Professor George Bush, a theologian at New York University and a distant relative of the future presidential family, published The Valley of Vision, a book that called for the restoration of the Jews to Palestine. Visual images of 19th century newspapers and magazines, headlines and articles discussing the Eastern question and the future of the Holy Land. Even Abraham Lincoln, amidst the throes of the Civil War, expressed his hope for a Jewish restoration. This American sympathy was a complex mixture of religious belief, romantic idealism, and a burgeoning sense of a shared destiny with a people striving for self-determination. On May 14, 1948, at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the State of Israel declared independence. Just 11 minutes later, President Harry Truman recognized the new state on the world stage. Their dream of establishing a nation in their ancient homeland seemed far-fetched and impractical. It's a wonderful place, filled with amazing people. Last week, for example, we talked about the curious role that clocks play in the Passover story. On May 14, 1948, at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, stood up and read the Declaration of Independence. This event was followed by a long and complicated process of international recognition that unconcern us too much today. What we will focus on is the lightning-fast recognition from Washington, D.C. Many in the U.S. felt compassion for the plight of European Jews after the horrors of the Holocaust. While many Americans supported the creation of Israel, that did unnecessarily mean they supported the idea of sending their sons and daughters into a conflict that was thousands of miles away. More than that, sending military aid to Israel would have enraged the surrounding Arab states who opposed the creation of Israel. And many in the U.S. government worried that such aid could provoke a wider regional conflict, which could potentially drag the United States into war. They wanted to offer refuge to those who survived the war and to help rebuild Jewish life. First, there was the Arab-Israeli peace process. As peace negotiations progressed, the U.S. became more deeply involved in supporting Israel's security. Second, there were domestic considerations. The pro-Israel lobby in the U.S. grew stronger, particularly after the Six-Day War in 1967. Following that conflict, the U.S. provided substantial aid to help Israel recover. Third, the changing political landscape also played a role. As the Cold War intensified, Israel became increasingly important as a strategic ally in the Middle East. Finally, there was a shift in public opinion. As the years went on, Americans increasingly viewed Israel as a vital ally, and humanitarian aid became a popular cause. I wanted to invite you again to our community, where each week we discuss Jewish history together. Plus, we've got a bunch of other great content that I think you'll enjoy as well. The creation of Israel offered an opportunity to do just that. He also likely saw the opportunity to help atone for past anti-Jewish sentiment in America and to help refugees find a new home. In the early moments of Israel's existence, the U.S. government was hesitant to fully embrace its new ally. While President Truman recognized Israel within 11 minutes of its declaration, it took months for military aid to follow. France, not America, became Israel's primary weapons supplier in those early days. The United States had concerns about provoking the Arab world and didn't want to become entangled in a regional conflict. Finally, he understood the geopolitical significance of a new ally in the shadow of the looming Cold War. However, when Israel requested planes to help evacuate British soldiers from the region, the U.S. approved the sale of 20 planes, but that wouldn't last forever. Over time, the U.S. perception of Israel shifted from caution to full-fledged support. We'll explore the impact of key events like the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War on U.S.-Israel relations. We'll also examine the role of domestic politics and the evolving nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict in shaping American support for Israel. Today, the U.S. is undoubtedly Israel's staunchest ally. They provide significant economic, military, and diplomatic assistance, and the transfer of another 50 from the Royal Air Force. Still, this wasn't very much, and it took several months for that aid to arrive. The United States hoped that these limited gestures would satisfy Israel's needs while avoiding a larger commitment. Just 11 minutes after Israel's announcement, President Truman released a statement declaring his support. As the New York Times wrote, the department had no advance information of the coming announcement and was given only a few hours. Notice, this lack of preparation contributed to the cautious approach taken by the administration. In fact, when Truman announced his recognition of Israel, The State Department didn't even have an ambassador in Tel Aviv. By the end of World War II, that would all change. And in today's episode, explore the relationship between the United States and the brand new state of Israel from the moment it was born. Well, just because Israel declared itself a state didn't mean that it was universally accepted as such. In fact, the vast majority of countries waited several weeks to recognize Israel. Many others never did. So why was the United States so quick to support this fledgling state? Now, this seemingly insignificant speed dating between two nations is actually a crucial moment in history. So, let's unpack why in today's episode. And many members of the Democratic Party had strong pro-Israel feelings. That was especially true of the president himself, Harry S. Truman. He supported Zionism in part because he saw it as a way to atone for the failings of the past. When discussing American Jews in his administration, Truman said that, quote, "They have my personal support and the support of the government, as long as they stay in the Democratic Party." But Truman also believed that a Jewish state would help block Soviet influence in the region. He felt that Israel would serve as a bulwark against communism and a strategic asset in the face of growing tensions with the Soviet Union. And that's exactly how things would play out during the Cold War. At the dawn of the 20th century, Zionists were viewed as outsiders with an almost mythical status in world Jewry. Now, you might be thinking, what was so hard about recognizing Israel? Why was that even controversial? Well, for one, the U.S. president was a Democrat, as was the majority of Congress. However, that wasn't the only reason why Truman supported the creation of Israel. But if Truman was so excited about creating Israel, why did the United States withhold aid in the early days of the Arab-Israeli conflict? Well, here's the thing. Additionally, the U.S. State Department was caught off guard by Israel's Declaration of Independence. Indeed, the official U.S. policy was to refrain from providing any form of military assistance. In the meantime, France emerged as Israel's main weapons supplier, not America. Why did the U.S. take this approach? Well, several factors contributed to the evolution of U.S. policy towards Israel. So why was Truman so quick to recognize Israel? Well, it seems that he felt compelled to honor his campaign promise to do just that. Today, it can sometimes feel like the United States and Israel are joined at the hip. But it hasn't always been that way. The last time we left off, Israel had just made a very impressive showing in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. And over the next few years, it would seem that all of their Arab neighbors were going to accept the existence of this Jewish state and move on with their lives. But that's not what happened at all. Instead, the Arab states regrouped, rearmed, and prepared to throw the Jews back into the sea. Today, we look at the wars and crises of the 1950s and 60s, and how they shaped the relationship between Israel and the United States. Israel, for its part, was suspicious of all of its neighbors and prepared for war. Many in the Israeli government believed that the Arab nations would eventually attempt to destroy Israel, and that the Egyptians in particular were preparing to do exactly that. In the Middle East, it has another name, the June War. That's because the Arab states refused to admit defeat. For them, they had not lost a war. They had only taken a temporary set of losses. How do I mean by that? Well, up until 1967, the U.S. had done everything they could to stop Israel from seizing too much territory. They pushed Israel to return the West Bank and Gaza to the Arabs in exchange for peace. And while the Israelis knew that the U.S. was being sincere, they didn't believe the Arabs would ever agree to such a deal. After 1967, though, the tables turned. Now the U.S. encouraged Israel to hold on to as much territory as they could. Although the fighting ended with neither side decisively winning, the U.S. had proven their commitment to Israel's security. This cemented the budding military relationship between the two countries, but it also led to the Arab nations imposing an embargo on oil sales to the West, leading to the 1973 oil crisis. And as long as Israel felt threatened, the U.S. would stand behind them militarily and financially. Israeli spy Shabazi Aharoni served for 18 years in the CIA. His intimate knowledge of Arabic helped the CIA gather valuable intel throughout the region. In 1976, the two countries conducted their first joint military exercise. And in 1981, they held a joint air exercise called Bright Star. In the mid-1970s, U.S. foreign policy formally embraced Israel as a key regional ally. This aid totaled over $100 billion between 1973 and 1990 alone. During this period, Israel also began receiving military technology from the U.S., and it seemed that the Arabs were finally accepting the reality of Israel's existence. Now, if you'd like to learn about how the Iranian Revolution nearly derailed the peace process and forced Israel to go to war again, then stay tuned for Episode 3. At first, this was mostly defensive systems like the Hawk anti-aircraft missile. If you really liked it, consider becoming a patron where you'll get to watch each episode 1 week early. Thanks for watching. But over time, it expanded to include F-15 fighter jets, F-16 fighter jets, nuclear-powered submarines, and the Arrow anti-ballistic missile system, among other things. This is often referred to as the birth of the special relationship between Israel and the United States. So while the rest of the world called it the Six-Day War, the Arabs called it the June War, hinting that this was only a pause in the fighting. That's about $6.5 billion today. This included sophisticated weaponry like the Hawk surface-to-air missile system, which proved vital in upcoming conflicts. This alliance was based on mutual interest. The U.S. gained a strong ally in a volatile region, while Israel gained military and financial support that it desperately needed. But Israel wasn't thinking along those lines. To them, the 1967 war was a decisive moment in history. Just 6 years after the Six-Day War, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The Egyptians broke through Israeli lines in the Sinai, while the Syrians attacked in the Golan. Israel was caught off guard, and things looked bleak. They had not only proven themselves capable of defending themselves, they had proven that they could dominate the region. But this is when things took an unexpected turn. With Israel poised to capture the Suez, the U.S. intervened and ordered them to halt their advance. Why? Because President Nixon needed the Egyptians as a counterweight to the Soviets. If Israel kept pushing and captured the Suez, then Nixon feared that the Soviets would step in and put a stop to it. Not to mention the U.S. feared that if Israel won too decisively, it might encourage the Arabs to seek closer ties with the USSR. This mistrust was only deepened when in 1956, Israeli agents assassinated Egypt's former Prime Minister Mahmoud Naguib. And while some Americans criticized Israel for striking first and for seizing territory, for the most part, the American public supported Israel. In fact, many Americans were thrilled that Israel had checked the ambitions of their greatest enemy in the region, the Soviet Union, who had been deposed by Nasser in 1954. Although the Israelis didn't get away with this event further strained relations between Israel and the Arab world. 3 years later, as tensions continued to rise, Israel would finally strike. On October 29, 1967, Israel launched a surprise attack against Egypt, catching them completely off guard. Within 6 days, Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, killing an estimated 8,000 to 15,000 Arabs and capturing the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. For them, the Soviet Union was simply the lesser of two evils. The U.S., they felt, supported Israel, the Zionist entity which had stolen Palestine from the Arabs. The Zionists, for their part, were staunchly anti-Soviet. Early Zionists like Theodor Herzl actually thought that the Tsar of Russia would help them establish their state, because he hated the Jews as much as they hated him. And even after the Russian Revolution, Israel maintained close ties to the West, especially after 1948, when the U.S. became their biggest supporter. In this struggle known as the Cold War, the U.S. backed various allies and spent billions to bolster their defenses against any possible Soviet invasion or attack. Now the U.S. did not want to do this alone. They wanted allies. So they sought to build up friendly governments around the world. Some of these were formal alliances like NATO and CETO. Others were less formal. You can also follow us on social media for more content throughout the week. As the Cold War intensified after World War II, both the United States and the Middle East, most Arab nations took the side of the Soviets, although they had no love for Moscow. By the 1950s, the Arab nations, spurred on by Gamal Nasser of Egypt, were openly calling for the destruction of Israel. Then, in 1957, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been under British and French control, deepening the rift between the Arab world and the West. This event is known in the U.S. as the Six-Day War. The United States, for its part, was surprised by the intensity and effectiveness of Israel's attack, especially since President Lyndon B. Johnson had tried desperately to prevent the war. And it was at this point that the U.S. decided to make Israel their local enforcer in the Middle East. And boy, did they stand behind Israel. Between 1967 and 1973, America gave Israel over $1 billion in military aid. But it wouldn't be long before this relationship would face its biggest test. Within 2 weeks, though, the tide had turned and Israel was pushing the Egyptians back to the Suez. As it turned out, the U.S. air lifted desperately needed supplies to Israel, helping them push back the Syrians and Egyptians. Following the Yom Kippur War, the U.S. realized that their relationship with Israel was worth cultivating. Beginning in the mid-1970s, Israel began receiving large amounts of military aid from the U.S. during this same period. Intelligence sharing between the two countries expanded significantly. Over time, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel grew stronger than ever. Chapter 4. Ideology, Lobbying, and Shared Values, 1980s-1990s. A new era in the U.S.-Israel relationship dawned in the 1980s. One defined not just by strategic interests, but by a powerful convergence of ideology, sophisticated lobbying, and deeply held religious beliefs. This period saw the alliance elevated to a quasi-sacred status in American public life, becoming a cornerstone of foreign policy for both Republican and Democratic administrations. The language of shared values and strategic consensus would echo from the White House to the halls of Congress and reverberate through influential segments of the American electorate, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape and America's role in the Middle East. The Reagan Revolution. A shining light of democracy, the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 marked a profound shift in the framing of the U.S.-Israel alliance. Moving beyond the realpolitik of previous administrations, Reagan articulated a vision of Israel as a moral and ideological partner, a fellow democracy standing against the tide of Soviet influence. His administration was populated by neoconservative thinkers who saw Israel as a formidable ally in the Cold War, a stable and reliable strategic asset in a volatile region. Reagan himself held a deep-seated, almost romantic admiration for Israel. He saw in its story a reflection of America's own pioneering spirit and its struggle for freedom. This sentiment was powerfully encapsulated in his frequent description of Israel as a shining light of democracy in the Middle East. This framing of the relationship as one between two sister democracies resonated deeply with the American public and helped to solidify bipartisan support for the Jewish state. This ideological embrace was formalized through a series of strategic agreements. A memorandum of understanding on strategic cooperation was signed, establishing a framework for joint military planning and exercises. The U.S. began to pre-position military equipment in Israel, and the two nations collaborated on intelligence sharing and counter-terrorism efforts. By designating Israel as a major non-NATO ally, the Reagan administration cemented a level of military and technological cooperation that was unprecedented. This strategic deepening was not without its moments of tension. The Reagan administration, proceeded with the controversial sale of AWACS surveillance aircraft to Saudi Arabia over strenuous Israeli and congressional objections. However, the underlying ideological commitment to Israel's security and its role as a strategic partner remained unshakable. The rise of AIPAC, a Washington powerhouse, as the ideological bonds between the U.S. and Israel strengthened. So too did the political machinery that sustained them. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, once a relatively modest lobbying group, transformed itself during the 1980s into one of the most formidable and effective interest groups in Washington. With a burgeoning budget and a sophisticated grassroots strategy, AIPAC mastered the art of political influence. It cultivated relationships with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, providing detailed briefings on Middle East issues, and framing support for Israel as a matter of American national interest. Pro-Israel political action committees, PACs, proliferated, channeling significant financial contributions to the campaigns of supportive candidates. AIPAC's influence was felt in a series of legislative battles, while it was unable to block the AWAC's sale to Saudi Arabia. The effort demonstrated its growing power and mobilized its supporters. In subsequent years, AIPAC successfully advocated for massive increases in foreign aid to Israel, making it the largest recipient of U.S. assistance. The organization also played a key role in thwarting arms sales to Arab nations deemed a threat to Israel's qualitative military edge. The lobby's effectiveness was such that it became a rite of passage for aspiring politicians to demonstrate their pro-Israel credentials. 9/11's The War on Terror and New Strategic Depth 2000's a global paradigm shift on a clear Tuesday morning. 4 hijacked planes crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania, killing nearly 3,000 people. The United States was traumatized, and within hours, the entire world order shifted. President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror, identifying al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and later, so-called rogue states as threats to Western civilization. For American policymakers, the map of the Middle East was redrawn not along Cold War lines, but along terrorist versus anti-terrorist alliances. And at the center of that map was Israel, in the post-9/11's world. Israel was no longer just a democratic ally, it was a battlefield-tested partner in the same war America had just entered. George W. Bush and Ariel Sharon. A new axis of counterterrorism, the relationship between President Bush and Prime Minister Ariel Sharon grew unusually close. Sharon, a former general with a hardline reputation, framed Israel's conflict with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestinian militants as Israel's version of the war on terror. Do not repeat the mistakes of Munich in 1938. Don't appease terror. Agreed. The administration endorsed Israel's targeted assassinations of suspected militants and the construction of a controversial separation barrier in the West Bank, measures once considered extreme, now rebranded as models for homeland defense. Israeli military doctrine, developed over decades of urban warfare and intelligence operations, became a blueprint for U.S. military planners in Afghanistan and Iraq. Where America had raw power, Israel had experience. And that experience was now invaluable. The Iraq War and Israeli intelligence shadowed support in 2003. The United States invaded Iraq under the belief that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and had links to terror groups. While Israel did not publicly advocate for the invasion, its intelligence agencies, including Mossad, privately supported the belief that Saddam's regime was a threat. According to some declassified reports and testimony, Israeli intelligence officials had warned U.S. counterparts about chemical weapons, mobile labs, and nuclear ambitions, all later proven false or exaggerated. Critics later argued that some Israeli intelligence reinforced pre-existing biases within the Bush administration, particularly among neoconservative figures who were deeply sympathetic to Israeli security concerns. But Israeli officials denied deliberately manipulating data. They argued they simply shared their genuine fears of Saddam's capabilities and intentions, especially his support for Palestinian groups like Hamas. In the years after 9/11's, U.S.-Israel military cooperation intensified like never before. Joint anti-terrorism training between the FBI, CIA, and Israeli Shin Bet. High-tech surveillance sharing, including facial recognition, drone footage, and airport security modeling. Homeland security contracts, where Israeli firms advised on U.S. border protection and urban policing methods. At the same time, the U.S. Congress approved massive increases in military aid, much of it earmarked for missile defense systems, including the Iron Dome, which would later protect Israeli cities from rocket attacks. The war on terror didn't just bring the U.S. and Israel closer, it embedded their security apparatus into one another. Public perception and political impact post-9/11's America also experienced a surge in pro-Israel sentiment. Media narratives portrayed Israel as a fellow victim of Islamist terrorism. Evangelical Christian support soared as terror was framed as a battle between civilization and barbarism. Pro-Israel lobbying groups, including AIPAs, found bipartisan consensus in Congress for Israeli aid, security assistance, and diplomatic cover, but critics began to emerge to questioning whether the U.S. was importing Israel's security state or entangling itself in endless Middle Eastern wars without solving root causes. Chapter VI. Military Technology and Economic Ties. 2020's billions in U.S. military aid to Israel since the early 2000s. The military relationship between the United States and Israel has evolved into one of the most extensive and well-funded in the world. The U.S. provides Israel with $3.8 billion annually in military assistance under a 10-year Memorandum of Understanding MOU signed during the Obama administration. This package includes foreign military financing FMF grants for Israel to purchase U.S.-made weapons systems, access to cutting-edge U.S. military technology, early warning systems, joint training programs, and logistical cooperation. Importantly, much of this aid must be spent within the United States, effectively subsidizing the American defense industry and creating jobs across the U.S. arms manufacturing sector. Joint defense projects, Iron Dome and beyond, one of the most visible symbols of U.S.-Israeli military collaboration is the Iron Dome missile defense system designed to intercept short-range rockets, especially those fired from Gaza. The United States co-funded its development and continues to provide replenishment funding. Key joint defense initiatives include David's sling and arrow missile systems for medium and long-range threats, joint military exercises such as Juniper, Cobra, and Noble Dina, real-time intelligence sharing, and deep coordination in counter-terrorism operations, cybersecurity partnerships, with Israel becoming a global cyber defense hub. The strategic value for the U.S. is clear. By investing in Israeli defense, Washington benefits from real-world battlefield testing of advanced technologies and gains a forward-deployed military partner in the volatile Middle East, high-tech innovation, Silicon Wadi, and economic alliance beyond defense. The U.S.-Israel relationship has flourished economically, particularly in technology and innovation. Israel's high-tech sector, dubbed Silicon Wadi means valley in Arabic, has become one of the world's leading innovation ecosystems. With more startups per capita than any other nation, Israel is home to breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, medical devices, and biotech defense, and surveillance tech, agri-tech, and water conservation. Major American tech giants, including Google, Microsoft, Apple, Intel, and Amazon, have invested heavily in Israel. Intel, for example, has R&D and chip manufacturing facilities in Israel and has spent billions acquiring Israeli startups. The economic ties are now inseparable from the strategic alliance. U.S. venture capital flows into Israeli innovation. Israeli breakthroughs benefit U.S. industries. The alliance is not just about geopolitics. It's about shared prosperity in the digital age. Controversy. Occupation and public divide. The Palestinian conflict, a persistent crisis despite decades of diplomacy and peace efforts. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains unresolved, with U.S. policy often at the center of the global debate. Key points of controversy include continued Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank, considered illegal under international law by most countries, but tolerated and, at times, indirectly supported by the U.S. The blockade of Gaza, in place since 2007, which Israel says is necessary for security, but critics argue has created a humanitarian crisis for over 2 million Palestinians. Periodic military campaigns in Gaza, such as in 2008, 2014, and 2021, which have drawn widespread international condemnation due to civilian casualties and destruction. Despite international pressure, the U.S. has used its veto power at the United Nations Security Council more than 40 times to block resolutions critical of Israel, shielding its ally from global censure. This unwavering diplomatic protection has fueled resentment in the Arab world and criticism from human rights organizations. Shifting American opinion, a growing divide. While U.S. political institutions remain broadly supportive of Israel, American public opinion has grown increasingly divided, especially along generational and ideological lines. Younger Americans, including millennials and Gen Z, are far more critical of Israeli policies, particularly regarding Palestinian rights, surveillance, and occupation. Progressive Democrats and figures such as Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have openly challenged traditional U.S. support for Israel, calling for conditioning aid or reevaluating military assistance. Conversely, mainstream Democrats and nearly all Republicans continue to support Israel, framing it as a key ally in a dangerous region. Polling from Pew Research and Gallup shows a clear partisan and generational shift. Older Americans and conservatives overwhelmingly favor Israel, while younger voters are increasingly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. The BDS movement and political backlash. The growing boycott, divestment, sanctions. BDS movement seeks to pressure Israel to end its occupation and comply with international law through nonviolent means. BDS has gained significant traction on U.S. college campuses and among activist groups. Supporters frame the movement as a civil rights effort comparable to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Critics, including many in Congress and pro-Israel organizations, argue that BDS is anti-Semitic or seeks to delegitimize Israel's existence. In response, over 35 U.S. states have passed anti-BDS laws, which restrict public contracts with companies or organizations that support boycotting Israel. These laws have triggered legal battles over free speech and the First Amendment, leading to ongoing court challenges. Abraham Accords and beyond. 2020's the Trump administration, a geopolitical earthquake. U.S.-Israel relationship reached a new level of strategic alignment under President Donald Trump. His administration delivered a series of dramatic policy shifts that fundamentally altered America's role in the Middle East and strengthened ties with Israel. U.S. Embassy moved to Jerusalem. 2018, breaking decades of U.S. policy. Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and relocated the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv. This move was hailed in Israel, but sparked global outrage and Palestinian protests, as East Jerusalem remains claimed by Palestinians as their future capital. Recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. 2019 in another historic move. The U.S. formally recognized Israel's control over the Golan Heights. Territory captured from Syria in 1967. This again went against UN resolutions and long-standing international consensus, but was framed as a national security issue. The Abraham Accords 2020. The Trump administration brokered a groundbreaking normalization agreement between Israel and several Arab nations, including United Arab Emirates, UAE, Bahrain, later joined by Sudan and Morocco. These agreements marked the first Arab-Israeli diplomatic breakthroughs in decades. Did not require Israel to make major concessions to Palestinians, breaking with the traditional peace model, opened up trade, tourism, and military cooperation between former enemies. Supporters hailed the Abraham Accords as a paradigm shift, while critics called them transactional deals that sidelined Palestinian statehood. The Biden administration, a balancing act. When President Joe Biden took office in 2021, he faced a more complicated and polarized landscape both at home and abroad. While committed to the historic alliance, Biden signaled a shift in tone and approach. Continued military and economic support to Biden administration has reaffirmed unwavering military aid to Israel, including the annual $3.8 billion security package and additional emergency funding for the Iron Dome system during conflicts with Hamas. More vocal criticism of Israeli policies in contrast to Trump. Biden and his team have been more outspoken in condemning civilian casualties during Israeli military operations in Gaza. They have also called for the preservation of the two-state solution, despite few concrete efforts to revive peace talks. Managing rising Democratic division, Biden must walk a political tightrope. On one side, progressive Democrats are demanding conditional aid and justice for Palestinians. On the other, mainstream Democrats and Republicans still overwhelmingly back Israel. The administration often emphasizes Israel's right to self-defense while quietly urging restraint behind the scenes. Asterisk, what lies ahead? As the geopolitical map of the Middle East continues to shift and the global balance of power evolves, the future of U.S.-Israel relations is poised at a critical juncture, no longer defined by Cold War logic or a monolithic American consensus. This alliance faces mounting pressure from both external threats and internal transformation. Regional dynamics, a fragile web of alliances, the Abraham Accords, shattered long-standing taboos and signaled a new era of Arab-Israeli cooperation. But the next chapter depends on deeper and riskier choices. Will Saudi Arabia, the Arab world's most influential power, normalize ties with Israel? Quiet diplomatic talks continue behind closed doors, but progress hinges on American mediation. Iran's behavior and potential concessions to the Palestinians. How will Iran's growing influence and nuclear ambitions shape the future? Iran's proxies Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and the Houthis continue to pose security threats to both Israel and U.S. interests. A shared enemy could further tighten Israel's security ties with Gulf states, drawing Washington into a more complex regional web. U.S. domestic politics, a house divided for decades. American support for Israel was a bipartisan constant. That is changing. Public opinion is fragmenting, with younger, more diverse voters increasingly questioning the morality and cost of U.S. military aid. Progressive lawmakers are calling for human rights conditions on aid, while others openly back the Palestinian cause. The political language around Israel is no longer untouchable. Future administrations, Republican or Democrat, may face growing pressure to reassess the special relationship and adapt to new geopolitical realities. Israeli politics, internal shifts, global impact inside Israel. Domestic transformations may challenge its closest ally. Far-right coalitions and controversial judicial reforms under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership have triggered mass protests, constitutional crises, and warnings from us leaders about democratic backsliding. settlement expansion in the West Bank continues to strain hopes for a two-state solution, risking broader conflict and alienating Israel's most vocal defenders in the West. Will Israel prioritize diplomacy and moderation or double down on militarism and ethno-nationalism? Conclusion: a historic alliance at the crossroads, the U.S.-Israel relationship has weathered war, terror, diplomacy, and protest. It is rooted in deep historical ties, shared strategic interests, and cultural connections. But it is not immune to change. As Iran flexes, Arab states realign, American politics polarize, and Israeli society fractures. The alliance will be tested like never before. Whether the coming years bring greater unity or deeper division, one truth remains: the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship will shape the fate of the Middle East and define America's role in the world. First, let's talk about sympathy. America had been sympathetic to the Zionist cause before the 20th century. And during the Great Depression of the 1930s, Jewish leaders argued that a Jewish state in Palestine would provide an outlet for American Jews fleeing the Depression. Well, as anti-Semitism continued in Europe, more Jews fled to America, especially after Hitler's rise to power in 1933. By 1941, more than 100,000 German Jews had entered the United States, and with them came stories of Nazi atrocities against Jews, further increasing sympathy for the Zionist cause. In a letter to his wife Bess, Truman explained his decision, saying, "It is a wonderful thing to see those people finally get their own country." Well, one reason was the moral imperative to create a safe haven for Jews after the Holocaust. The establishment of Israel can be seen as a response to the failure of the international community to protect Jews during the Holocaust. The genocide of 6 million Jews by the Nazis created a sense of urgency and determination to ensure the safety and security of Jews worldwide. The establishment of Israel provided a refuge where Jews could live free from persecution and violence. Additionally, the support of the United States was crucial in the establishment of Israel. The U.S. played a key role in the United Nations vote to partition Palestine into two states and was the first nation to recognize Israel's independence. The US's recognition legitimized Israel on the international stage and provided it with valuable political and financial support. Moreover, the timing of Israel's establishment was influenced by the end of the Second World War and the subsequent creation of the United Nations. The war had highlighted the need for a new international order that would protect the rights of all peoples, including the Jewish people. The UN provided a platform for the international community to address this need and support the establishment of a Jewish state. Furthermore, the Zionist movement had been advocating for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine for several decades before the Second World War. The movement gained momentum after the war and culminated in the UN vote to partition Palestine. The U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv opened on June 29, 1948, with the first American ambassador arriving in July. However, the U.S. did not establish full diplomatic relations until 1950, when Israel appointed an ambassador to Washington. Why the delay? Well, as mentioned earlier, several Arab nations had opposed the establishment of Israel, and the U.S. didn't want to antagonize them. It wasn't until the U.S. withdrew from the UN resolution establishing the State of Israel, along with the Arab nations that had sponsored the resolution, that the U.S. was able to establish full diplomatic relations with Israel. Despite the initial hesitation, the U.S. has become one of Israel's staunchest supporters, providing it with military and financial aid and serving as a mediator in the Arab-Israeli conflicts. Then there was the Holocaust, the genocide of 6 million Jews during the Second World War, created a moral imperative for the establishment of a Jewish state in the minds of many people around the world. In addition, support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine increased among non-Jewish Americans, especially after the Holocaust. Polls showed that nearly 70% of Americans favored the establishment of a Jewish state, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt began expressing support for it as well. However, he did not want to antagonize Arab countries. So he hedged his support and did not push for recognition of a Jewish state after its establishment. With that said, it should be noted that many American Jews did not support the establishment of a Jewish state, seeing it as unnecessary and even undesirable. But the Arab leadership rejected the plan, and violence between Jews and Arabs escalated. Nevertheless, in 1947, Congress passed a resolution recognizing the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The following year, 5 Arab states attacked the new state, but it survived. Now, this brings us to President Truman. He faced opposition from his own State Department and military advisors, many of whom believed the U.S. should remain neutral on the issue of Israel's statehood or even side with the Arab states. They argued that recognizing Israel would antagonize the Arab world and potentially jeopardize U.S. interests in the region. Additionally, some argued that the U.S. should not recognize Israel until it established diplomatic relations with neighboring Arab states. However, Truman decided to recognize Israel just 11 minutes after its declaration, on May 14, 1948, becoming the first nation to do so. He did this despite the fact that Israel had not yet been formally recognized by the UN and without consulting Congress, which was dominated by Democrats opposed to Israel's recognition. Truman's decision was based on his personal beliefs about the moral imperative to support a Jewish state in the aftermath of the Holocaust, as well as his belief that recognizing Israel would help repair relations with European Jews who had been critical of the U.S. during the war. They argued that American Jews could live full and meaningful lives in America without needing a separate state. These two groups would eventually come to be known as the American Jewish Committee and the American Jewish Congress. They differed over whether a Jewish state was necessary or desirable, and whether support for a Jewish state should be the primary focus of American Jewry. A wave of Jewish immigrants fled persecution in Russia in the late 19th century, many settling in the United States. And during the same period, the idea of cultural Zionism developed among American Jews, who advocated for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Many of these people had no intention of moving to this homeland, but rather viewed it as a place where their cultural and religious distinctiveness would be preserved. By the beginning of the 20th century, more than 30,000 American Jews had visited Palestine, and the idea of a Jewish homeland started taking root. After the First World War, the idea of a Jewish homeland became even more popular, not only among Jews, but also among some non-Jewish Americans. The president of the American Zionist Medical Association in 1918 said the movement for a Jewish homeland in Palestine has come to stay, and it will not rest until it reaches its goal. But the U.S. government took a different view. While sympathetic to the Zionist cause, President Woodrow Wilson was hesitant to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, fearing it would antagonize the Arabs with whom the U.S. had hoped to forge a strong alliance. Instead, Wilson supported the British Mandate over Palestine, which allowed for the immigration of Jews into Palestine, but did not establish a Jewish state. Chapter I. Foundations before Israel as early as the 19th century. American Protestant leaders were advocating for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which they believed was prophesied in the Bible. In 1923, a conference of American leaders representing major Protestant denominations affirmed the biblical basis of Zionism. Now, what about the influence of Jewish people? At the end of the war, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. Truman's advisors were surprised by his decision, but it was consistent with his long-standing support for Zionism. Why are the U.S. and Israel such close allies? That's what we're exploring today. Why are the U.S. and Israel such close allies? That's what we're exploring today. It's a relationship that has endured for decades and continues to grow stronger with each passing year. But why are these two nations so close? What is it about their shared history, values, and interests that have brought them together? In this video, we will take a look at the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship and explore the factors that have made them such close allies. On one hand, they had just won a major victory and established itself as a sovereign nation. However, these relationships were short-lived and ultimately did not provide the level of support that Israel needed. As a result, Israel began to focus on developing its own weapons capabilities and building up its military forces. This led to the creation of some highly advanced and innovative technologies that would later become famous around the world. They knew that they could rely on anyone else for protection and had to be prepared to defend themselves at all costs. Meanwhile, the United States continued to provide economic and development aid to Israel. But military assistance was still off the table. At first, they were concerned about the political fallout of supporting Israel, especially in light of the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict. Well, for starters, Israel was a strategic asset in the ongoing battle against communism. Both the U.S. and Israel were founded on principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Israel, as a small nation surrounded by hostile neighbors, desperately needed military support to protect itself from external threats. The U.S., on the other hand, was engaged in a global struggle against communism and needed a reliable ally in the Middle East. In addition to military and economic aid, the U.S. also provided Israel with diplomatic support on the international stage. This was particularly important for Israel, as it helped them to gain recognition and legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. By forming an alliance, both nations could pool their resources and work together to achieve their respective security goals. This common set of values created a sense of mutual respect and understanding between the two countries, laying the groundwork for a strong partnership. There were definitely some bumps along the road. For example, the U.S. was initially hesitant to provide military aid to Israel during the Arab-Israeli conflicts. But as the Cold War intensified, the strategic value of Israel as an ally became clear and military assistance soon followed. And the shared commitment to democracy, human rights, and freedom of speech continues to be a cornerstone of their relationship. By forming an alliance with Israel, the U.S. gained a foothold in the Middle East, which was a key area of interest during the Cold War. Additionally, Israel was seen as a potential counterweight to the growing influence of the Soviet Union in the region. But as the Cold War tensions heated up, the U.S. started to see the strategic value of having an ally in the Middle East. Despite the challenges and complexities of the Middle East, these two nations have managed to forge a strong bond that has stood the test of time. Whether it's on the battlefield or in the halls of international diplomacy, the U.S. and Israel can count on each other to have their back. And that's something that both nations can truly appreciate. Israel, on the other hand, was pretty eager to form an alliance with the U.S. They knew that they were a small nation, surrounded by hostile neighbors, and they needed all the help they could get. That all changed in the 1960s, when the U.S. began to provide Israel with some much-needed military support. This marked a significant shift in the relationship between the two nations and laid the groundwork for the strong alliance that exists today. But on the other hand, they were now stuck in a region full of hostile Arab nations who were just waiting for their chance to strike back. Their shared commitment to democracy, human rights, and freedom of speech has only strengthened their bond. And despite the ups and downs of the Middle East peace process, their alliance has remained steadfast. Okay, so picture this. Israel, Britain, and France team up to invade Egypt. Why, you ask? Well, Egypt's leader Nasser had just nationalized the Suez Canal, which was a major strategic asset. And that did unsit well with the British and French, who felt like they had lost control of a key waterway. Enter Israel, who saw an opportunity to get involved in the conflict and maybe even get some support from their American ally. But here's where things took a turn. This created a sense of urgency for Israel to seek out new allies and secure its borders. But the United States wasn't exactly eager to step in and help. You see, during the 1950s, the U.S. was still trying to navigate the complexities of the Cold War, and they didn't want to make any moves that could potentially alienate their Arab allies. They knew that the Middle East was a volatile region, and they did unwant to upset the balance of power. Plus, they had already taken some heat for recognizing Israel in 1948, so they were hesitant to get too involved. The alliance between the United States and Israel is one of the most important in the world. Well, in the case of the U.S.-Israel relationship, it seems to be true. The story of the U.S.-Israel relationship began way back in 1948 when Israel declared its independence. President Eisenhower saw the invasion as a threat to peace and stability in the region and quickly condemned the attack. He also pressured Israel to withdraw their troops, which they eventually did. This was a major turning point in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, because it showed that the U.S. wasn't willing to blindly support Israel in all of their actions. And that's coming from someone who recognized Israel's right to exist. Back then, the Middle East was a tinderbox of conflict, and tensions were high as Israel found itself under attack from neighboring Arab nations. Now, during this time, the United States had just emerged as a global power, and President Truman was eager to make a good impression on the world stage. So when Israel came knocking, seeking recognition and support, Truman decided to take a chance. He became the first world leader to recognize Israel and pledged his support in the face of adversity. This bold move sent shockwaves throughout the region and the world and established a foundation for the U.S.-Israel relationship that would endure for decades to come. You know how they say that everyone has a past. You see, after Israel declared its independence, it was immediately attacked by neighboring Arab nations. And let's just say that Israel was outnumbered and outgunned. That's where the United States stepped in. To help out, Truman imposed an arms embargo on both Israel and the Arab states involved in the conflict. Basically, he said, "Hey, cool it down, guys. No more weapons for you." Now, on the surface, this might seem like a pretty neutral move. After all, an arms embargo is just a way to prevent things from escalating further, right? Well, yes, but it also meant that Israel wouldn't receive any military aid from the U.S. to help them defend themselves against the attacks. Talk about adding insult to injury. Luckily for Israel, they had other sources of weapons, and they managed to survive the first Arab invasion. But let us just say that nobody was too happy about the United States' decision to impose an arms embargo on them. But it wasn't all smooth sailing from there. There was still the small matter of Israel's survival to worry about. In the aftermath of the war, Israel found itself in a bit of a pickle. Despite the US's reluctance, Israel pressed on and sought out other potential allies, including France and Britain. Then came the Suez Crisis of 1956. Let's talk about it. You see, while Israel, Britain, and France were able to achieve some early victories, the United States wasn't exactly thrilled about the whole situation. But despite this setback, Israel continued to develop their military capabilities and build up their arsenal. In the years since, the U.S. and Israel have stood by each other through thick and thin, providing military, economic, and diplomatic support to one another. It's interesting to note that the U.S. didn't jump at the chance to form an alliance with Israel right away. In fact, they were pretty cautious about it. So what exactly was it about Israel that appealed to the U.S. so much? Another factor that contributed to the alliance was the shared democratic values between the two nations. But perhaps the most important factor in the formation of the U.S.-Israel alliance was the mutual need for security. Now, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel wasn't always smooth sailing. As the alliance between the U.S. and Israel grew, so did the amount of support they provided to each other. Today, the U.S.-Israel alliance is stronger than ever. In conclusion, the U.S.-Israel relationship is a testament to the power of shared values, strategic interests, and mutual respect. What do you think? What factors have contributed to the close alliance between the U.S. and Israel? Let us know your thoughts.